everyone, welcome back to Creatively Crafted Life. This is Melanie and I'm starting a new series. I'm calling it Card by Number, kind of a play off of a paint by number situation. So this is probably geared to people that aren't as familiar with card making or want to get into the hobby, but of course it could still provide inspiration for those of you that have been crafting for a long time. But I know when I was talking to some of my friends who are getting in, they really want to know all the specific details in order to make the card. So what I'm going to show you here is we're going to make 2 cards. So all the measurements will be for 2 cards. And we're going to do one card, I'm going to call it more a level 1, and then we're going to step it up and make a level 2 card as well. So it's the same design, we're just going to add a few more ingredients to up the game, so to speak. What you will need to make both cards. So first of all, the first card, you're going to need an embossing folder. Now, I'm making Christmas cards and Christmas is just around the corner, right? So I picked an embossing folder that has snowflakes on it. This was a Sizzix embossing folder called Winter Wonderland. I think it was, oh no, it's Cuttlebug, sorry, not Sizzix. It's a Cuttlebug embossing folder called Winter Wonderland. You got 5 folders as part of the set. Really, any embossing folder that you think will coordinate with the stamp you're going to choose is perfect. So just pick an embossing folder that you have. If you don't have an embossing folder, I still recommend doing something to the background to make it a little bit more interesting, or else this card is going to be super simple. Okay, so if you don't have an embossing folder, which also means you would need some sort of die cutting machine to run this through, you can use a bone folder just to draw or score lines in the background of your paper. That will work as well. Or another option is to just stamp something in the background to make it interesting. But I'm going to assume that you have embossing folders and you have a machine to use that as well as for cutting out, which will be the next thing that I'm going to show you. Then what I want you to do is find in your stash a stamp set. Now I'm going to do snowflakes. If you've got a snowflake stamp in your collection, that's great. If you've got a Christmas tree, that will work too. The big thing we're going for here is size. So this particular stamp is about 4 inches tall by roughly 3 3/4 wide. So you want something in that range. It doesn't have to be exact. There's no rules or anything, but you want a fairly large image that's going to fill up your card front. Now, if you don't have something this large, this particular stamp set, which is from Stampin' Up, it's an older set called Festive Flurry, you could use a combination of 2 and combine them on the front. So that's another thing that you can do. But for all intents and purposes, for this particular video, we're going to go with a large central focused image. You will also want some sort of sentiment, and I've picked one here from Stampin' Up. It's called Greetings of the Season, and I'm going to use Merry Christmas. But any one of these would probably work, maybe not Peace on Earth with the size, but you're looking for something that's going to be within a 1 inch width and no longer than 4 1/4 inches wide, preferably smaller than that. Okay, in this particular case, the sentiment I am going with is about, it's just over 3 1/4 and about 3/4 at, not quite 3/4 at the highest point. Okay. The other thing you're going to need in order to create both cards is either a stamp block that's big enough to hold your stamp or a stamp positioning tool. And I'm opting to use a stamp positioning tool because it's handy. Okay. This is not necessary. Definitely if you have a regular stamp block, that will work. Unless, of course, your stamp you're using is wood mounted, and that would work too. Okay? Okay, let's talk other supplies. You're going to need some sort of ink. Now, in order to do the second stage of this card, you're going to need an ink that has pigment in it, so that is sticky, or not really sticky, but it stays wet for longer, because we're going to use another product that needs that in order to adhere to your image. So I'm going to use Distress Oxide, and this is in Candied Apple. Now you can use Versamark for stage 2, so those of you that have been in this for a while will understand what I'm talking about when I talk about Versamark. But I found for this particular technique that having a colored ink actually works better, because it's not a perfect, you won't get perfect results, and this masks that. So one ink, Distress Oxide, Candied Apple is what I'm going with. You'll need a pair of scissors, and you'll need some foam tape or foam squares or fun foam, anything that's going to give you dimension. So that is all you're going to need for the first basic card. However, if you want to do both cards as stepped up version, by all means you can do so. But that's the first basic card. For the stepped up version, you're going to need a couple more things. You're going to need red glitter or any glitter of your choice. I just happen to be going with red because I chose candy apple. If you choose a blue, then choose a blue glitter. Okay, so you want these to coordinate to be almost the same. Again, the idea is we're going to mask imperfections by using the color. There's a product out there called Heat and Stick Powder. This was from Stampin' Up. I think Judykins has sticky embossing powder, or maybe it's from Ranger, has sticky embossing powder. It's all the same thing. Basically, when you heat this up, it turns into an adhesive or a glue-like substance. So you're going to need that. You're also going to want some sort of fluffy brush to clean things off. And you're going to need a heat tool or a heat gun. I have a Stampin' Up one. Any heat tool that gets hot enough is going to work. A hairdryer probably won't work. It's not, the heat is too diffused and doesn't get very hot. So we do recommend a heat tool of some type. And then I'm going to use a tray, and I'm going to use a scrap piece of paper. And that is for collecting the glitter and the heat and stick powder. You don't need the tray. You can use 2 pieces of computer paper if that works for you, or if you have 2 trays, you can use 2 trays. I'm going to show you both so you can see what's what. And that's all you're going to need for the second version or the stepped up version. Okay, now let's get to the cardstock that you're going to need to make the cards. Now remember, this is for 2, so everything has been kind of doubled. You're going to need 2 A2 card bases. An A2 card base is basically half a sheet of an 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock. Nice and convenient. So all I did was I took an 8.5 by 11 piece of cardstock and I cut it at 5.5. And then I scored it at 4.25. So now you see here, and then this is at 4.25, and that creates an A2 size. If you want a top folding, you're going to do the opposite. So you would cut at 4.25 and score at 5.5, and then instead of having the fold here, you would have the fold here. The fold doesn't matter for this particular card, but it's just something personal preference, basically. I also have an envelope ready, so I have no excuses to write these Christmas cards when it's time. So I have 2 card bases. I also took half a sheet of cardstock again. So this is 5.5 by 8.5. I also cut 2 rectangles from the rest of the sheet. So like this, right, is a full 8.5 by 11. Only I trimmed these after I cut them to 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. Okay, so this was originally 4.25 by 5.5, and now it's 4 1/8 by 5 3/8. And that way, when we add it to our card base, we're going to have a very tiny border all the way around. Okay, so you need 2 sheets of those if you're going to make both cards. And then just dig through your scraps and find some white cardstock that's at least 1 inch wide. So I had some leftover scraps. This ends up being 1 inch by 8.5 inches. Okay, so 1 inch by 8.5. It can be less than 8.5. It just has to be at least, I would say at least 5 inches. Okay, because we're going to wrap this around the card, and you want to have enough left over on the back side to wrap. So at least 5, maybe 6 would be even better. For ease of purposes, mine was already at 8.5, so I just trimmed it to 1 inch wide. Okay, so those are the numbers. Let's get started. Now that we've got all the numbers out of the way and you have all your cardstock started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to stamp our images. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take the 5.5 by 8.5 sheet of cardstock. And again, if you're using a stamp platform, you're going to want to position that, tuck it right into the corner, and add your magnets. If you're using a block, of course this doesn't really matter. Just have the paper down ready to go. We're going to ink up the Distress Oxide on here. And we want to make sure we have really good coverage with this. And the beauty of using a stamp positioning tool, of course, is that if you didn't get it perfect, you can always restamp it. Okay, so you can see I didn't get quite as good coverage in the center as I would like, so I am going to stamp this again. Especially as this is going to be my less complicated, or version 1 of my cards. So I want this to be a little bit more perfect, or as close to it as I can get. We don't stress about those things too much. Let me give it some good pressure. Now I'm using a cling mounted stamp, which means it does have, it's a red rubber stamp but without the block. And if you're using it with your Misty platform, make sure you remove the insert piece. There should be a foam piece inside, and we're just going to remove that. Okay, that looks much better. Then we're going to flip this around and we're going to do the other side. Now, if you are not using a stamp tool and you're moving around or you're playing around with the paper, make sure you don't touch the image, because this has some pigment ink in it. It is going to take a little bit longer to dry and it can smear, so we don't want that to happen. Okay, and I am just going to give this one another shot too. This ink pad is not as juicy as I would like it to be, so I might have to get a refill. Either that or I'm just not pushing enough. Sorry for the glare. Okay, we're going to remove these stamped images now, and this is the side that we're going to do step 2 on. Okay, so now what we want to do is you want to take your tray or your piece of cardstock, whatever it is that you're using, and we are going to just apply this heat and stick powder on this second snowflake. Okay, and I'm pretty liberal because this is all going into the tray, and I'm just going to put it back in the container, so there's no need for me to worry about it. Okay, and I'm only going to very lightly tap it because I want as much coverage on this as possible. If I notice that there's any gaps missing, I will add some, but there will be some places where this just doesn't stick, and that's okay. That's why we used the red ink in the first place. Okay, we're going to put that aside. So now what we want to do is we want to take our heat tool and we want to heat it up, and we want to run that over this image until it just melts. Okay, you do not want to over process this because it won't do the next step very well. So this is going to be a little bit loud. I will probably cut this out so that you don't have to listen to it. But again, just keep in mind we want to go over this as quickly as possible just until it melts. So just like that. Okay, let's put this aside and clean up this mess, and then we'll bring out the glitter. Okay, so I mentioned that it's also possible to use just a plain piece of paper. This is just printer paper. I folded it in half to form a little bit of a V. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the same image. Again, we're only going to do this on this particular side. We're going to take our red glitter. And again, I'm pretty generous because I know this is going to all end up back in this container. And we're just going to kind of swirl it around a little bit and then tap it lightly. You probably shouldn't do this with a fan on, but it's so hot here today that I have to have one. Okay, now you'll see that there's a lot of glitter all around here. Don't worry about it yet at this point. Just put this aside carefully. Take your piece of paper that has all the glitter in it. Okay, we're just going to kind of lightly tap it and shake it. Take our little jar, and then we're just going to tip it and pour it all back in very carefully. Don't get too crazy. And I don't worry about that little bit because glitter reproduces overnight, I think, and it seems like the jar never goes down. We're going to take the heat tool again, and now this time we're going to go over the image one more time, and that is going to set the glitter into that glue. Now, I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but you will see that it's not perfect. Like for instance, here there's no glitter. It's a little bit messed up over here. You know, it's not perfect there, but that's okay, because really the glitter sparkles and shines and we use the red base, so it's not really noticeable that we don't have 100% coverage. So we're going to put this aside for a minute and just let it cool down, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so we're going to take out our stamp block or stamp platform again. We're going to add our sentiment onto it, and we're going to take one of the sheets, or one of the pieces, the 1 inch strips, and we're going to tuck that in here as well. Now this is going to be longer than this because of the way I set this up. You could have set it this way, but I'm not too worried about it, so I'm just going to leave it as is. So we're going to use the same ink, the Candied Apple. And again, remember, this is going to stay wet for a little bit, so you want to make sure that you do not touch this for a little bit after you stamp it, okay? And that's what it looks like. So we're going to repeat this for a second one. Make sure you put this away out of reach so that you're not going to touch and smear it. If you want to use your heat tool, you definitely can, to give it a zap, and that will help dry it up. Okay, now it's time to pull out your die cutting machine. Now I have a Big Shot. My plates are very well worn and used and very warped. It still works, so I'm not too stressed out about it. You're going to take your 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 pieces of cardstock, as well as your embossing folder, and you're just going to slide this piece of paper inside the folder. Now, depending on your machine, you may have to change your sandwich or your configuration of plates. In this case, I am just going to take tab 2 off, run that through my machine, lay down one plate, lay down my embossing folder, and then my top cutting pad, and run this through. And I am going to do this twice, meaning once on the first sheet of paper and then again with the second sheet of paper. And that, hopefully you can see it, is what it looks like. Very cool. Okay, so now we're going to pull back our stamped snowflakes, and we're going to take that fluffy brush, and we're just going to lightly go over top of the image with the glitter. And we're just going to get rid of all that loose glitter that was on there so that we don't have it shedding everywhere. Now, if your stamp set comes with a die, which mine does, we're going to cut that out next. If it doesn't, you can always just hand trim it out. I like to leave a little bit of a border when I hand trim. It kind of masks the imperfections, so that's something to keep in mind. So in this case, with the Big Shot, I want to have the tab 2 down. I want to then have my bottom plate. This is my cutting plate. I'm going to lay down my image and line up, and we're going to put the top plate on very carefully. If you're worried about shifting, you can always tape this down with a little bit of washi tape, just to make sure it doesn't shift on you. And we're going to do this twice, once for the non-glittered and once for the glittered. And that's what it looks like all cut out. Let me do the other one. Now we're into assembly mode. Let me get this stuff put away, and then we'll come back and we'll put it all together. I forgot to mention this at the start. You're also going to need some sort of adhesive. I am going to be using Scotch Create Tacky Glue. I actually transfer this to a fine line bottle. I prefer the way this distributes it. Now this is a little bit thick, so when I put it in this bottle, I always add a few squirts of water, just a couple little sprays of water, and that seems to help it flow a little bit better. So that's what I'm using here. So at this point, what you should have your 2 card bases, your 2 embossed sheets, your 2 snowflakes, and your 2 sentiments, some of the foam adhesive, your pair of scissors, which you may or may not need, and your glue. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the front side of the embossed image. So I consider this the front side where the snowflakes are out of the paper, versus this is the debossed where the snowflakes are into the paper, but it's up to you what your personal choice is. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the non-glittered one. Actually, at this point, that's all the same instructions. We're going to take the non-glittered one and we're going to add foam tape to the back. So let me go do this and then I'll show you what it looks like when that's done. Okay, so that's how much foam adhesive I put on mine. I think that's good enough. And all we're going to do is we are going to center this on the front of that embossed panel. And I'm just eyeballing it because life is too short to measure everything. Okay, we're going to do the same with the other piece and the other image. Okay, you should now have two panels that look something like this, and the next step that we're going to do is add the sentiment. So you're going to take the sentiment and you're going to put it across the middle, and you're going to want, well, I prefer to center the sentiment, but it's up to you. Measure it approximately where you want it to go, and then fold over the edges like so. Okay, and then you're going to see on the back, if you used an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, the ends are just going to meet. And what we're going to do now is we're going to glue those down at the back. Now this paper is embossed, so you do want to make sure that you have good contact with what paper is not debossed, so that it sticks. Okay, so it now should look something like that. Let's do the other one. So the final step is to add foam tape to the back of the panels. You don't have to do this if you don't wish to, but I think a little added dimension adds a little bit of something to a fairly simple card. I'm just going to add a few strips here on the back, and then we'll attach it to the card base. The next step is to attach it to the card base. You do want to make sure that it is opening in the right direction, so the fold is on the left, not on the right, or if you did the top fold, that it's at the top and not at the bottom. Trust me, I've learned the hard way. So I always try and double check, but every now and then I forget, and then I end up with the card going in the opposite direction. As I mentioned before, this is slightly smaller than the card front, so you should end up with a very thin border all the way around. And just like that, we have two cards. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this inspires you to start on your holiday cards. If you do send them out, you know, December will be here before we know it, so it's always good to have at least a few under our belt before then. Let me know below what you think of this. Let me know below what you think of this style of card where it's very explanatory and it gives you all the measurements, etc. If this is something that you are interested in, I'm more than happy to do more of these. If you really could care less and just show you the end product, maybe with a little bit of my thought process, I can do that too. I just know that there's people out there that are just starting, and sometimes this hobby can seem a little overwhelming. So if I can do anything to help you get started and use your stash, I'm more than willing to do so. Thanks again, and until next time, happy crafting.